They called it development assistance. But here's the question almost nobody asks. How did a continent holding some of the world's largest reserves of gold, diamonds, cobalt, oil, uranium, fertile farmland, and countless other resources become known not for its wealth, but for receiving foreign aid? How did places that once financed European empires end up borrowing money from the very countries that became rich from their resources? Was it simply corruption? Bad leadership? Or was Africa's dependence on foreign aid built into a system that began centuries earlier? Because once you trace the money, the trade routes, and the political decisions, an uncomfortable pattern begins to appear. A pattern that suggests aid may not have created dependency. It may have been designed to manage it. For centuries before European colonization, African kingdoms traded across deserts, oceans, and forests. The empires of Mali, Songhai, Benin, Ethiopia, Great Zimbabwe, and many others exported gold, ivory, salt, iron, textiles, and agricultural goods. Cities such as Timbuktu became famous centers of commerce and learning. Africa was never isolated. It was deeply connected to global trade. Then everything changed. By the late 19th century, European powers gathered in Berlin. Remarkably, no African ruler was invited. Yet during the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, European governments divided almost the entire continent among themselves, with rulers and maps spread across tables thousands of kilometers away. Borders ignored languages. They ignored ethnic groups. They ignored existing kingdoms. What mattered wasn't history. What mattered was profit. Colonial governments weren't interested in building diversified African economies. They wanted raw materials. Railways weren't built to connect African cities to each other. Instead, many rail lines stretched from mines or plantations directly to coastal ports, making it easier to ship resources to Europe. Roads followed the same logic. Entire economies were reorganized around exporting cocoa, coffee, cotton, rubber, copper, diamonds, gold, palm oil, or other raw materials. Manufacturing was discouraged. Processing industries were limited. Colonies became suppliers of cheap resources and buyers of expensive finished products. It was an economic design that benefited European industries while leaving African economies dependent on external markets. When independence movements swept across Africa after the Second World War, there was enormous optimism. New flags were raised. National anthems echoed through crowded streets. Leaders promised industrialization, education, healthcare, and prosperity. Political independence had arrived, but economic independence was much harder. Many newly independent countries inherited economies built almost entirely around exporting one or two commodities. If world prices fell, government revenue collapsed. If drought struck, exports declined. If foreign buyers reduced demand, national budgets suffered. The structure of the economy remained largely unchanged. Then came another challenge. Building a modern nation costs money. Schools, hospitals, roads, power stations, factories. Governments needed enormous investments, but domestic savings were often too small. So they turned to international lenders. Loans initially appeared to be the perfect solution. Borrow today, grow tomorrow, repay later. It sounded simple. Until global conditions changed. During the 1970s, many African governments borrowed heavily while interest rates were relatively low. Then the global economy shifted. Interest rates increased dramatically. Commodity prices weakened. Debt repayments exploded. Suddenly, countries that had expected manageable loans found themselves trapped beneath mountains of debt. Some spent more servicing foreign loans than investing in education or healthcare. That's where international financial institutions entered the story. Organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank offered emergency financial assistance, but the money often came with conditions. Governments were encouraged or required to reduce public spending, privatize state-owned companies, remove subsidies, open markets to foreign competition, reduce trade barriers. These policies, commonly known as structural adjustment programs, were intended to stabilize struggling economies and restore growth. Supporters argue that they addressed serious fiscal problems and corrected inefficient government policies. Critics argue that, in many cases, the rapid implementation of these reforms placed heavy burdens on ordinary citizens, weakened public services, and limited government's ability to pursue their own development strategies. The effects varied from country to country, but the debate continues today. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a second to like the video and subscribe. It helps more people discover these forgotten chapters of history, and there's much more to uncover. Now, here's where the story becomes even more complicated. Aid itself is not inherently harmful. Millions of lives have been saved through emergency food assistance, vaccination campaigns, disease control, disaster relief, and humanitarian support. During famines, wars, and epidemics, foreign aid has often been essential. The question isn't whether aid can save lives. It clearly can. The deeper question is why so many countries repeatedly needed it. Part of the answer lies in how global trade continued to operate. Many African nations still exported raw materials while importing finished products at much higher prices. A country might export cocoa beans for relatively little value, only to import chocolate produced elsewhere at many times the price. Copper left Africa, electrical equipment returned, cotton was exported, finished clothing came back. The highest profits were often earned far from where the resources originated. Meanwhile, multinational corporations invested heavily across Africa, bringing jobs, technology, and infrastructure in many cases. Yet critics argue that weak governance, unequal bargaining power, tax avoidance, and capital flight sometimes meant that a significant share of the profits flowed abroad instead of remaining within local economies. Again, experiences differed across countries. Africa is not one story. It is 54 nations with different histories, governments, and outcomes. Some countries managed their natural resources relatively well. Others struggled with conflict, corruption, political instability, or external interference. Domestic leadership unquestionably mattered. Poor governance has harmed economic development in many places. Corruption diverted billions that could have funded schools, roads, and hospitals. Civil wars destroyed infrastructure. Political instability scared away investment. Ignoring these realities would present only half the picture. But focusing only on corruption tells only half the story as well, because corruption exists across the world. Few regions, however, entered independence with economies intentionally designed around extracting wealth, rather than creating it. History left a very heavy inheritance. Even today, many African governments continue working to reduce dependence through regional trade, industrialization, technology, manufacturing, renewable energy, agriculture, and expanding education. The African Continental Free Trade Area aims to increase trade within Africa itself rather than relying so heavily on markets outside the continent. New industries are emerging. Technology startups are attracting investment. Manufacturing is growing in several countries. Progress is uneven, but it is happening. The story of Africa is far more complex than headlines about aid suggest. It is a story of extraordinary natural wealth, colonial extraction, debt, global markets, political choices, international institutions, successes, failures, and a long struggle to reshape an economic system built generations ago. So the next time someone asks why Africa receives foreign aid, perhaps the better question is this: how does a continent so rich become financially dependent in the first place? Because understanding the answer isn't just about Africa, it's about understanding how the modern global economy was built and who benefited from its foundations.